A person cannot change baseball history, but a person carrying the truth of themselves can force us to confront death in a way that cannot be avoided. In old age, Denny McLain has witnessed more loss than most people could endure and still go on existing. The happy ending did not happen. He buried his career while it was still far too young, lost his family, lost his honor, lost his place in the collective memory, and watched the dream once celebrated by the entire nation burn to ashes right before his eyes. Now, when the years ahead are no longer long enough to promise any redemption, McLain is saying something that stops anyone who hears it cold. When asked about death, he does not dodge, does not hide, does not try to make it sound softer. His answer cuts through decades of myth, excuses, and silence with brutal honesty. He does not talk about fear of dying, but about the lowest points of his life, when everything was taken away one by one, and nothing was left strong enough to cover the feeling of failure. Not prison, not oblivion, but the moment he understood that history would never come back to apologize or open its arms to him. And every other loss, over time, seems to fade before that truth. But what led an once unbeatable baseball genius to such a cold acceptance of his own death? We are all the same in this respect. What can break one person will very likely break anyone else if they have to carry it long enough. The answer does not lie in a single mistake, but deep within an entire life, full of accumulated pain, successive failures, and losses heavy enough to crush weaker people. The 1968 season, with its 31 wins that once made America lift its head in pride, now exists as a heavy shadow over every thought about his death, reminding that the peak came too early and the price paid lasts a lifetime. There is no Hall of Fame waiting, no ceremony to close the story, no crowd rising to applaud to make the past bearable, just one man facing death, not in despair, but in the profound exhaustion of someone who has lived too long with what cannot be fixed. This is not the polished version of the Denny McLain story. This is the raw truth of what happens when glory arrives before a person has time to mature, when life strips away everything once considered important, and when the greatest courage is no longer fighting to live, but accepting that some lives are not to be saved, only allowed to end in truth. If you want to understand what truly pushed Denny McLain to this cold state of acceptance, subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in the next part of the story. Denny McLain's youth did not begin with preparation, but with a straight thrust into the spotlight before he had time to understand who he was off the field. He stepped into the world of professional baseball when his mind was still that of a teenager, not yet taught how to endure failure, not yet shielded from the cost of expectations, and never having had a family solid enough to tell him that a person's worth does not lie only in victory. There was no one on the sidelines to pull him back, no system to cushion the sharp edges of fame, and no safety net for those first falls. In the achievement-worshipping atmosphere of that era, baseball quickly swallowed McLain, not just as a career but as his entire living identity. He learned how to pitch before he learned how to understand himself, learned how to be cheered before learning how to face doubt, and learned to believe that as long as there were wins, nothing else mattered. Long practices, back-to-back games, roaring applause replaced the role of family, of guidance, of ordinary conversations about fear and limits. At an age when many are still fumbling to find themselves in the wide world, McLain was locked into a single definition: winning pitcher. And in that definition, there was no room for weakness, no room for confusion, and certainly no room for a plan B if tomorrow his arm no longer obeyed. The absence of psychological foundation meant each success did not bring solidity, but only made the fear of loss greater, because if baseball was everything, losing it meant having nothing left to hold on to. McLain grew up amid cheers, but not amid safety, and that was the seed of the tragedy that would follow him his whole life. He learned to measure his worth by the stat sheet, by the win column, by what others said about him after each time he stepped off the mound, and gradually came to believe that if those numbers ever disappeared one day, then he himself would disappear with them. No one taught him that achievements come and go, that the body will tire, that time never stands still to wait for a genius to mature. Instead, he was encouraged to keep going, stronger, faster, higher, while inside he remained a boy never asked what he feared most. Baseball became his only refuge, but also his only cage, because every emotion, every choice, every value in life was forced to revolve around a ball and a throwing arm. With no family as an anchor, with no support system to remind him that failure was not the end, McLain was forced to build his identity on the most fragile foundation possible, performance. And such a foundation, even built on glory, always carried within it the risk of collapse. It was in this phase, long before the scandals, the prison sentences or the forgetting, that the root wound formed quietly but persistently. The belief that without baseball, he would be nothing. That belief did not hurt immediately, but it took deep root, waiting for the right moment to surface, when the arm tired, when wins grew scarce, and when the world began to see him not as an unbeatable icon, but as a human who could fall. 1968 did not come to Denny McLain as a season, but as a tsunami that swept away every last anchor he had not yet built. 31 wins rang across America like a miracle, a number that seemed to belong only in stories told generations later, and McLain, still very young at the time, was thrust straight into a place history usually reserves for those who have taken enough hits to understand the cost of glory. The entire nation hailed him as a symbol, as the answer for an era needing heroes, but behind those waves of applause, no one asked if he was ready. No one checked whether his mind had enough space to hold all the expectations just placed on his shoulders. Win after win, and each time he stepped off the mound, McLain carried not just the pressure of the next game, but the burden of having to repeat the unrepeatable, of having to remain the perfect version of himself in a year no one else could touch. He was called a phenomenon, living history, the pride of American baseball, but in the rare moments without cameras and crowds, he began to feel a strange loneliness, an emptiness right in the middle of victory that no one had taught him how to fill. The more he won, the wider the gap grew between the real person and the iconic image, and McLain gradually understood that he was no longer allowed to fail, no longer allowed to doubt, no longer allowed to be an ordinary human being. 1968 turned him into what all of America wanted to believe, but it also took away his chance to become what he himself needed to survive long-term. In the public eye, it was the year of miracles, but in McLain's inner world, it was the year when every other door began to close, for when you have reached a peak that cannot be surpassed, every path ahead leads downward. He lived in a cruel paradox: the more loved he was, the more isolated, the more celebrated, the more trapped in the role history had chosen for him. Each win that season did not just add a number to the stat line, but tightened the invisible noose around his life, because from that moment, every year after would always be measured against a standard that could never be recreated. McLain began to feel that 1968 was not a memory to return to, but a life sentence, where he was condemned to live forever in the shadow of himself, with no chance of appeal, no expiration date. That feeling did not arrive as an instant shock, but seeped in slowly through each morning, waking to the same quiet question: how do you keep living when the best of everything is already behind you? Amid the applause, the magazine covers, the praise, McLain was rarely alone with his own thoughts, and precisely for that reason, he also had no chance to realize that the loneliness was growing right in the moments the world thought he was happiest. 1968 gave him no time to adjust, no space to step back and understand that victory is not a place to stay forever, but only a brief stop. When the season ended, when the lights dimmed and history began to write, McLain did not walk out of that year as a victorious man set free, but as someone locked forever into a single moment, where every mistake afterward would be seen as decline, every subsequent effort would be considered failure, and every ordinary moment would become meaningless next to a year no one could surpass. That peak broke his life in half, in a silent but total way, dividing it into two parts that could never balance. Before 1968 was the climb upward. After 1968 was the long chain of days trying to live alongside a memory that refused to fade. McLain gradually realized he was not just trapped in one great year, but trapped in history's gaze, where the real person behind the wins was no longer allowed to change, no longer allowed to weaken, and no longer allowed to escape the role all of America had placed on him when he was still too young to understand that a peak, no matter how brilliant, could become the harshest cage of a lifetime. After 1968, Denny McLain did not plunge straight into the abyss, but slid slowly down an inclined plane with no handrails, while the world's expectations remained frozen at the peak he had left behind. His performance began to waver, not in an immediately disastrous way, but in a very human way. Games that were no longer perfect, days when his arm was no longer sharp, moments when victory no longer came as a given. But the terrifying part was not the decline itself, but that the expectations never scaled back with it. The public, the press and the league still demanded that McLain be the version from 1968, that he recreate what was inherently unrecreatable, and every time he failed to meet that demand, disappointment quickly turned into doubt. The media, which had once lifted him up as an icon, began to change its tone, no longer praising but probing, no longer protecting but scrutinizing, as if they were waiting for the hero to stumble to prove that every miracle must eventually end. McLain felt that shift very clearly, and instead of being guided to adapt, instead of being helped to understand that decline is a natural part of sports, he chose the only response his young ego knew: defiance. He met doubt with a challenging attitude, met pressure with impulsiveness, and met the fear of losing his place by exaggerating the very image that had once made him loved. But ego is never a healing remedy, it is only a rigid armor that makes every impact hurt more. When McLain was no longer an absolute asset, MLB gradually changed its view, from protecting to controlling, from tolerating to punishing, and behaviors once overlooked when he was an icon began to be brought into the light, as evidence of being uncontrollable. He was fined, warned, treated more as a problem to be solved than as a person to be supported, and in that process, the fragile trust between McLain and the American baseball system shattered into pieces that could never be mended. Every reaction, every word or action out of line, was no longer recorded as the impulsiveness of a star, but as a sign of someone losing control. The fall began not with a sensational moment, but with the accumulation of times he was no longer defended, times he was looked at with wary eyes, and times he felt he was fighting alone against a machine that had once celebrated him. McLain did not know how to step back, did not know how to be silent to heal, because no one had ever taught him that admitting he needed help was not failure. Instead, he kept pushing forward, trying to prove he was still worthy, while every step forward brought him closer to the edge. MLB, which had once seen him as the face of an era, now began to draw clear boundaries, and each boundary felt to McLain like a betrayal. He felt unprotected, untrusted, and that anger became fuel for the next wrong decisions. Once the momentum of the fall had begun, no one was close enough to reach out, because in many eyes, McLain was no longer a victim of pressure but the agent of his own decline. And so the fall continued, without breaks, without warning signs, without escape, only one man slowly realizing that after the peak, not everyone gets saved, especially those who were never prepared for the moment they begin to fall. Once the fall had begun and there were no breaks, the first thing that could no longer keep up with the pace Denny McLain's mind still tried to force was his body. The arm that had carried him to the top of history began to betray him quietly but decisively, not with a dramatic injury. The whole world could notice, but with nagging pain. Mornings waking up stiff, throws that no longer followed his thoughts, even though he still believed that just a little more effort would be enough. Pain became part of the routine, and McLain learned to live with it like a duty, because in the world he knew, stopping meant admitting defeat. But the body does not negotiate. It only remembers every overload, every time it was pushed past its limits, and then one day it simply stops obeying. Every loss of control on the mound was not just a failed athletic moment, but another deep crack in the identity he had built his whole life around, because if he could no longer pitch like before, then who was he? McLain was still very young when this happened, too young to understand that every athletic career eventually ends, and far too young to have a life plan for the day the athlete identity is taken away. No one prepared him for the after, no one told him there was another life waiting beyond the field, where a person's worth is not measured by pitch velocity or win totals. Instead, he was left alone in the cruel intersection between a weary body and a mind still trapped at the peak, where every good memory became an accusation against the present. Every injury, every early exit from a game, every time he felt his arm was no longer his own, brought a wave of panic that McLain had no language to express, because from childhood, he had only been taught how to win, never how to let go. The athlete identity began to dissolve before he could grasp what he was losing, and that dissolution did not happen in one moment, but in hundreds of small details. The doubting looks from teammates, the wariness from coaches, the hanging questions about form, and the growing fear that he was about to become something sports no longer needed. When the body was no longer a reliable tool, McLain lost the only anchor he had ever had, and the mental void began to widen like a bottomless chasm. No more practices to give a sense of control, no more games to temporarily forget everything else. He was forced to face himself, for the first time without the protective armor of achievement. But facing it brought no healing, because in that void there was no ready-made other self to cling to, only questions never asked before, and the fear that his life might have ended before it could begin in any other way. McLain was not equipped to live in uncertainty, and when his body collapsed faster than his mind could comprehend, he fell into a painful state of suspension, where the past still screamed to be relived, the present kept reminding him of new limits, and the future appeared as a shapeless blur. That void was not loud or dramatic, but it swallowed him gradually, taking away the ability to imagine another life, and leaving a young man trapped in the feeling that what had made him who he was disintegrating, with no path pointed out to move forward. When the ball field was no longer a safe refuge, Denny McLain brought all the broken pieces of himself back home, and it was there that the tragedy continued to unfold in a way more painful than any athletic failure. Family, once expected to be the last anchor, gradually became the clearest mirror of his human disintegration. McLain's marriages did not collapse because of one single dramatic moment, but because of accumulated exhaustion day after day, unspoken anger, prolonged silences that no one had the strength left to fill. The man who left the field each day feeling stripped of identity did not know how to step into the role of an ordinary husband or father. He brought his old ego, the ego nurtured by victory and adoration, into a family space that required listening, patience, and the ability to admit weakness. But McLain did not know how to do that, because no one had ever taught him that love does not operate by win or lose rules, that in a family, being right matters less than staying. The early arguments still revolved around money, pressure, and the future, but gradually they turned into wordless battles, where everyone was exhausted and no longer believed they were truly seen. His children grew up in that atmosphere, witnessing a father physically present but increasingly distant emotionally, a man caught in inner wars with no ability left to share or protect. That distance did not come as a betrayal, but as the natural consequence of no one knowing how to live with a person who was breaking like that. McLain, in his desperate attempt to hold on to his old identity, unintentionally pushed his loved ones away, because the ego that had once helped him survive on the field now became something no one in the family could endure. The people who had loved him kept trying, but that effort slowly turned to weariness, then to silence, and finally to leaving. When the relationships shattered, McLain did not just lose his family, he lost the sense that there was any place he could return to without judgment, without comparison to his past. The field had turned its back, and now the home was no longer a safe haven. The last anchor outside of sports vanished, leaving a void deeper than any injury had ever caused. McLain began living in a new kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of someone completely abandoned, but the loneliness of someone with no one close enough to reach. He still had family on paper, still had relationships existing on a formal level, but the real connection had broken, and that hurt more than any clean break. None of them could live with the version of the person McLain carried after the peak, and he himself did not know how to become another version. Every attempt to mend ended in disappointment, because unnamed wounds kept smoldering, and pent-up anger found ways to escape at the wrong moments. McLain began to realize that he had not only lost his career, he was losing the ability to be loved in an ordinary way, because to be loved a person needs to learn how to let go of their old image. But for him, letting go felt like another death, because that ego had once been the only thing keeping him alive when everything else collapsed. When his family could no longer bear it, McLain could not blame anyone, but he also could not forgive himself, and that inner tearing made loneliness a permanent state. He lived among loved ones yet felt adrift, lived through conversations yet found no common voice, and lived with the awareness that he had become a burden to the very people who had once been his reason to keep going. Loneliness was no longer a fleeting feeling, it became the encompassing space of every day, where McLain gradually grew accustomed to having no one to lean on, no one to share with, and no one close enough to witness his collapse except himself. It was in that silence, when family was no longer a refuge, and the field had closed its door, that McLain began sliding deeper into a life where the presence of others grew faint, and loneliness, though painful, became the one thing that never left him. After the family fell apart and the ball field closed its doors, what remained around Denny McLain was not peace, but the cold emptiness of someone who had once been celebrated by the entire nation and then left abandoned in silence. And it was precisely in that emptiness that money, the thing that had once poured in like a flood when he was at his peak, began to become another trap. McLain had never been taught how to manage money, because throughout his youth, baseball had played every role: teacher, father, guide. When fame arrived too early, money did not carry the meaning of responsibility or security. It was simply the reward for victory, something to fill the void inside. He trusted people who called themselves friends, advisors who promised to help him make money to help him maintain the image of a star, even after the stage lights had gone out. McLain did not read contracts carefully, did not ask questions, did not take control. He placed trust in the wrong people, because his whole life he had been accustomed to handing himself over to the system, the team, the league, the coaches, and believing that someone would always step in to protect him. But this time no one did. Reckless financial decisions, shady projects, and relationships built on fading fame quickly drained whatever he had left. The celebrity lifestyle, with big houses, luxury cars, and the need to keep up appearances, became an unsustainable burden. McLain spent as if tomorrow would still bring million-dollar contracts, when in reality it would not. Every bill that arrived was a cruel reminder that that era was over. From being a millionaire, he slid gradually into financial crisis, then into free fall. And when the money vanished, the people around him vanished too, leaving him alone to face the consequences. The feeling of being stripped bare in front of society at that moment hurt more than any injury on the field. With no halo left to shield him, McLain had to confront the judgmental stares of the public, people who had once exalted him, now remembering only the mistakes. The media no longer told the story of a baseball genius. It focused on the stumbles, the bad decisions, the wrong names he had trusted. In their eyes, he was no longer an icon but a cautionary tale. The most painful part was not losing the money, but realizing he had never truly understood its value, just as he had never been prepared to live without relying on fame. Each financial mistake felt like another deep cut into the sense of worthlessness that had formed when he lost his athlete identity. He tried to cling, tried to prove he was still somebody, but the more he struggled, the more tangled everything became. Those years McLain lived surrounded by debt, regret, and shame. He understood he had been taken advantage of, but he also understood a harder truth. No one forced him to sign those agreements. He chose to trust because he could not bear the feeling of being abandoned one more time. And it was that fear of abandonment that led him to the wrong people, the wrong decisions, and a spiral hard to escape. Money, once a symbol of success, now became a mirror reflecting everything McLain had never been taught: how to slow down, how to set boundaries, how to protect himself. When society saw him as a failure, he began to look at himself with profound exhaustion. No more field to escape to, no more family to hold on to, no more assets to cover the fear. He stood naked before his own life. And in that nakedness, a painful realization took shape. Losing money was only the surface. What he truly lost was the belief that he deserved protection and love, when he had nothing left to give. When the money ran dry, and the wrong choices demanded their price one by one, the law entered Denny McLain's life not as an abstract boundary, but as an iron door slamming shut behind him with a dry, unforgettable echo. Convicted, handcuffed, the moment marked not just the final collapse of a man who had once stood at the peak, but the decisive end of any illusion that his glorious past still held some power to save him. When the cold cuffs tightened around his wrists, McLain understood very clearly that the name once chanted by all of America now held no value in this space. It did not lighten his sentence, did not earn him different treatment, and could not pull him out of the reality crashing down. The first time he stepped into prison, he felt a kind of emptiness he had never experienced before, deeper than loneliness, because this was a place where the past no longer mattered, and the future had no shape. The thick walls and locked doors did not care who he had been, how many winds he had thrown, what he had symbolized. They existed only to remind him that from now on he was no longer a story, he was a file. His name was erased from everyday address, replaced by a number, a code, an identity stripped of history, stripped of memory, and stripped of any respect. In that space, the ego McLain had carried his whole life, the ego nurtured by victory and attention, began to die quietly, not in a dramatic collapse, but through slow, ruthless erosion. No one left to prove anything to, no one to challenge, no one to blame but himself. He was forced to confront the most stripped-down version of himself, a person no longer allowed to hide behind achievements or fame. The days in prison stretched on identically, no climax, no highlights, only time flowing steadily to force him to look straight at the decisions that had brought him here. McLain had once thought he had hit bottom when he lost his family, when his arm no longer obeyed, when the money disappeared, but prison gave him a different definition of bottom, the place where you have no role left to cling to, where you exist and no one cares where your story began. In that total stripping away, he gradually realized that the most painful thing was not the punishment, but being forced to live without the familiar identity. Those long nights in his cell, McLain no longer faced the media or the public, he faced himself, with questions he could not avoid about responsibility, about choices, and about the truth that no one else could be blamed for the path he had taken. The old ego, once loud and combative, had no ground left to stand on, and silence began to replace it with a terrifying emptiness, where he did not know who he was when no one was watching, judging, or expecting anything. This was the deepest fracture of his human identity, because it did not just take away physical freedom, it peeled away every layer of definition McLain had used to survive his entire life. He was no longer an athlete, no longer a husband, no longer a father in any full sense, and now no longer a free citizen. He was simply a person who had to learn how to live with consequences without any beautiful story to comfort himself. In prison, time did not help him forget the past, it forced him to look at the past from an unforgiving angle, where every mistake stood out clearly, unsoftened by explanations or sympathy. McLain gradually understood that this was not just legal punishment, but the end of a phase of existence built on escaping responsibility through fame and power. When the ego died in silence, what remained was not liberation, but a heavy stillness, where he began to feel clearly that his life had turned onto a road with no return, and that from here on, any effort to keep living would have to start from zero, from a person with no name, no past to lean on, and no clear future to hope for. When the prison door opened, and Denny McLain stepped back into the outside world, there was no moment of rebirth, no brilliant light, no arms outstretched to welcome him like someone returning after a trial. The society he returned to was not the same one that had once celebrated him, because while he was gone behind bars, the world had kept moving forward without needing any memory of him. Sports had moved on, baseball had written new chapters, new records, new faces, and the 1968 season was now just a line in the history books, not something that made anyone pause to wonder how Denny McLain was living now. He returned legally free, but there was no position left to return to, no team waiting, no social role held in reserve, and no clear path to start over. The people who once knew him as a legend now remembered him only as a name tied to scandal, and most everyone else did not even remember who he was. McLain realized very quickly that no one needed his story anymore. No one wanted to hear about what he had lost, what he had come to understand, or what he regretted. In a world that runs on speed and novelty, the story of someone who had fallen no longer had any exchange value, and the silence he had to face was colder than any sentence ever handed down. Post-fame life was not loud, not dramatic, but cruelly empty, where every passing day reminded him that his existence no longer created any ripples. He walked streets where his photo had once hung on front pages, but no one recognized him, and if someone did, the look they gave him was no longer admiration but curiosity, wariness, or pity. That coldness came not just from others, but from his own sense of not belonging anywhere anymore. McLain was no longer an athlete, no longer a public figure, and no longer an individual clearly defined in any community. He existed like a shadow, passing through life without leaving a trace, living in temporary spaces and fragile relationships, where the past was always present like a whisper but never allowed to be spoken aloud. Each day after release was a bitter lesson in the world's indifference, in the fact that history has no obligation to wait or forgive. McLain understood that he had not only lost fame, he had lost the right to tell his story in his own way, because society had framed him in a simple image and kept moving forward. His existence was now no longer measured by achievements or failures, but by the ability to endure a life where he no longer mattered to anyone except himself. And it was in that faded state of existence that McLain began to feel a new kind of pain, not sharp like the earlier falls, but more persistent and quiet, when every day he continued to live came with the awareness that the world had moved on while he remained stuck, like a long shadow of a once very real person now existing only on the edge of collective memory. After returning to free life in the form of a shadow, Denny McLain gradually realized a paradox even more painful than being forgotten. He was not completely forgotten, he was remembered wrong, remembered incompletely, and kept in historical memory in a way that left no room for the real person. The media, whenever mentioning the name Denny McLain, almost always repeated the same familiar phrase, 31 wins. That number was invoked like a pure miracle, a cold statistical milestone, detached from all the consequences that followed it. No one asked what the price was. No one dug deeper to see how many years of youth, how many relationships, how many wrong choices had to be traded for a person to reach that peak too soon. The story was shortened, flattened, framed into a single year, as if McLain's entire life was merely a footnote to one line of data in the record books. The injustice lay in the fact that historical memory does not lie, but it also does not tell everything. It chooses to remember what is easiest, most beautiful, most tidy, and skips what is complex, contradictory, and uncomfortable. McLain was kept in the role of an icon that had fulfilled its purpose, while the rest of his life, the decline, the mistakes, the years of paying the price, was treated as noise, as unnecessary detail for the glorious story history wanted to tell. Every time he saw his name appear in an article, a stat line, or a chapter of baseball history, he realized it was not him, it was a version stripped of context, made safe and easy to digest. No one asked how McLain had lived after that number no longer protected him, no one asked what he had learned when everything collapsed, and no one asked whether he wished to be understood more than admired. The pain of not being understood was not loud, not explosive, but it settled like thick sediment over the years. McLain did not need to be defended, but he longed for an acknowledgement that his life was not just a statistical example, that behind 31 wins was a person who paid a price few others had to pay. When history kept only the achievement, it inadvertently erased its own responsibility for having pushed a too young person into an iconic role, and then abandoning him when things were no longer perfect. McLain understood that history had no obligation to be fair, but that unfairness still left a deep wound, because it made him feel as though he had lived a life that was never allowed to be told in full. Every time he was mentioned in that reduced way, McLain felt himself pulled back to a year he could not surpass, while all the years that followed were treated as excess not worth caring about. He was remembered incompletely, the sleepless nights, the self-questioning, the moments of realizing he had gone too far with no way back. He was remembered wrong as a pure symbol of success, when he himself knew clearly he was a living example of the price of success arriving too early. That quiet injustice could not be sued, could not be refuted, because it was cloaked in celebration, and that made it hurt more, because how do you argue against a memory called glory? In that silence, McLain learned to live with a hard-to-accept truth. Some people are not forgotten, but they are never understood. Their lives are framed in a single moment, and all efforts to keep living afterward happen outside history's line of sight. For McLain, that pain did not lie in being undervalued, but in being misjudged, seen but not seen through, and mentioned in a way that kept the real person forever outside the story his own life had created. After being remembered wrong and kept in history as a number, Denny McLain entered the longest and heaviest phase of his life, the years when there was no one left to blame. He lived quietly, not trying to appear and retell the story differently, not standing up to refute what people wrote about him, not seeking to soften collective memory with late explanations. That silence was not a strategy. It was the only choice left when he understood that any defense would come too late. McLain did not seek to clear his name, because deep down he knew there was no simple version of the truth that could wash away everything that had happened. He had gone through the phase of blaming the system, the media, the people around him, and finally realized that every time he dodged responsibility, it only prolonged the torment. When there was no one left to point at, he was forced to turn inward and face the hardest thing, admitting that most of what happened was the direct result of his own choices. Taking full responsibility did not bring instant release. It did not lighten the past or make the present easier to live in. On the contrary, it opened a new burden, heavier and more enduring, because from then on, there was no reason left to shield the pain. The self-reproach stretched across decades, not erupting into violent crises, but existing as a quiet, steady current that followed him through every year. There were mornings he woke feeling everything had settled, only for an old news clip, a familiar number, or a sudden memory to rise up and bring it all back as if it had never left. McLain learned to live with that self-reproach not by driving it away, but by accepting its presence as part of himself. He understood that not every mistake can be fixed, and not every life gets a chance to start over. Learning to be silent with himself became a survival skill, because if he kept arguing with the past through anger or regret, he could not go on living. That silence was not avoidance. It was a conscious form of endurance, where he allowed memory to exist without trying to change it. In those years, McLain did not seek forgiveness from the public, nor did he wait for a day when history might look back more gently. He lived day by day with the understanding that peace, if it came at all, could only come from stopping the fight with the past. And it was in that prolonged silence that he gradually realized a bitter but clear truth. When there is no one left to blame, when all excuses are exhausted, the only thing left to hold on to is not the hope of being understood, but the ability to keep existing alongside what he had caused, in silence, without fanfare, and without any more attempts to escape himself. After many decades of living in silence and taking responsibility, when Denny McLain says he wants it to end, that statement is often misunderstood as an invitation to death. But for Denny McLain, what he wants to end is not life itself, but the prolonged inner war that has drained every ounce of energy for existence. He is not sitting around waiting for death, nor wishing it would come sooner. He simply no longer wants to keep fighting himself every day, no longer wants to wake up to the same trial in his head, where he is simultaneously the defendant, the prosecutor, and the jury. For years McLain lived as though every morning offered another chance to rewrite the past, to find an alternate chain of choices, a fork in the road where, if he had turned correctly, everything could have been different. But the longer he lived, the more he understood that the past is not a rough draft, and no power exists to rewrite it. Wants it to end, therefore, is the desire to stop the illusion that anything can still be fixed, that if he thinks long enough, torments himself deeply enough, he will find the right answer to a problem that no longer has a solution. The painful truth McLain had to learn is that some mistakes are not born to be forgiven, and some lives are not designed to close in reconciliation. He gradually stopped seeking forgiveness from the public, because he understood that forgiveness, if it comes, cannot be a campaign, cannot result from explaining or recounting. He also stopped hoping history would treat him more gently, stopped waiting for the day when the number 31 wins would be placed beside a longer, fuller footnote. Instead, he learned to accept that he would forever be an uncomfortable story, an incomplete example, a person society does not know where to place comfortably. Letting go of the need for forgiveness did not make the pain disappear, but it stopped the pain from spreading further, because from that moment, McLain no longer gave others' gazes the power to decide the value of the rest of his life. Wants it to end also means ending the endless dialogue with the old ego, the ego that once believed that if he won enough, won big enough, all other deficiencies would be compensated. McLain spent his entire youth fighting first against opponents on the field, then against the media, the system, oblivion, and finally against himself. When all the external battles ended, the internal one continued, because he did not know how to live without confrontation. But age and exhaustion taught him a different lesson. Not every battle needs to be won, and stopping does not always mean surrender. For McLain, stopping is acknowledging that he no longer has the strength to keep prosecuting himself, that continuing to live no longer requires additional punishment. Accepting to live with mistakes is not a noble act, it is a raw truth. McLain does not embellish the past, does not call mistakes by softer names, and does not shift responsibility to circumstances. He simply accepts that what happened will accompany him to the end of his life, as an inseparable part. In that acceptance, there is sadness, shame, regret, but also a rare kind of quiet, where he no longer has to react every time memory knocks. Wants it to end is the wish for that quiet state to extend, for the remaining days not to be dominated by the need to prove, explain, or beg. At this stage of life, McLain is not seeking a happy ending, because he understands that not every story is granted that privilege. What he seeks is an honest ending, where he is allowed to live out the rest of his life without playing any role other than himself, a person who erred, paid the price, and is still here. When he says he wants it to end, McLain is talking about the desire to stop the tearing, to stop waking up every day to wrestle with questions that no longer have answers. That is not a call for death. It is the sigh of someone who has lived long enough to understand that sometimes the greatest courage is not continuing to fight, but stopping, laying down the weapons, and accepting to stand still before what cannot be changed. After accepting that it will not end in the way people usually hope, Denny McLain stepped into another realm of existence, where the concept of glorification is no longer tied to redemption. He was not forgiven by history, not given back the halo, and there was no moment of rebirth to erase what happened. But precisely in the absence of that miracle, another form of honor began to take shape, quietly and unnamed. Denny McLain did not run away. He did not disappear from life to avoid responsibility, did not hide behind half-truths, and did not try to reappear with polished retellings to soften collective memory. He chose to keep living in silence, a silence not of cowardice, but of someone who understood that any words now would be superfluous. Not being redeemed does not mean complete destruction. McLain is still there, waking up each day and continuing to live with what he caused, without trying to transfer that burden to anyone else. His courage does not lie in standing up to justify, but in staying with the truth, even when that truth offers no comfort. He takes responsibility to the end, not through grand declarations, but by not denying, not softening, not blaming. In a world that often encourages people to rewrite their stories, to make them easier to hear, McLain accepts letting his story exist in its rough, uncomfortable state. Continuing to live in silence is a cruel choice toward himself, because silence does not shield, does not distract, and does not allow easy forgetting. Every passing day is another time he walks past old memories, without the shield of defense. But that is what creates a kind of greatness without glory, greatness in the ability not to flee consequences, greatness in accepting that some people must carry their story as a warning, not as an epic. McLain was not allowed to become a comfortable role model, but he became a living testament to the price of talent, arriving too soon, and the price of not being protected in time. The honor in tragedy is not for those fully healed, but for those who dare to stay when every exit road is open. McLain could have chosen to vanish, to sever ties with the past, or to seek attention by stirring old controversies. But he did not. He let time pass without trying to control how he is remembered. In that letting go, there is a rare kind of honesty, where a person no longer lives to be understood, but lives only to not betray their own truth. Courage to take responsibility, until the end of life, is not something easily visible from the outside. It creates no explosive moments, makes no crowd stand and applaud, and does not soften harsh judgments. But it is a quiet, enduring courage, existing through every day lived on without reward. McLain was not given back honor, but he kept something less often mentioned: consistency with himself in the phase when every motive to pretend had vanished. A kind of greatness without glory is often not recognized while it is happening. It only becomes clear in retrospect, when people realize that some individuals are not allowed a beautiful ending, yet still choose not to make the rest worse. McLain did not become a story of complete redemption, but he became a story of responsible endurance. And in a world of legends usually polished for easy remembrance, that refusal to be polished is what makes his story, though painful, carry an irreplaceable value. After all those years of living in silence and taking responsibility, Denny McLain entered the present in a state entirely different from the man who once fought the whole world. He is no longer angry, no longer impulsive, and no longer has the need to prove he was once right or once treated unfairly. The anger that once helped him survive phases of attack and doubt fell away over the years, not because it was resolved, but because there was no longer enough energy to sustain it. McLain understands that anger only has meaning when it leads to action. In this phase of life, every action has already reached its limit. What remains is a quiet stillness, a silence he once feared, but now has learned to accept. He no longer resists memory. The images of 1968, of the field, of prison, of faces that left still appear, but they no longer provoke violent reactions. McLain does not try to drive them away, nor to hold them. He lets them pass through his mind like old winds, carrying familiar feelings, but no longer destructive power. Resistance once made memories sharp. When he stopped resisting, memory lost its greatest power. He accepts that he is a painful story, a story not designed to bring comfort to listeners, and not born to end in redemption. Accepting that does not make the pain disappear, but it places the pain in its proper position, as part of his personal history, no longer the center controlling every thought. The exhaustion McLain carries in the present is deeper than ordinary sadness. It is not the sadness of a specific event, but the accumulated weariness after a lifetime of dealing with consequences. He is not sad about losing glory, that sadness passed long ago. He is tired from living long enough to understand that some losses are never compensated, and do not need to be. That exhaustion makes him no longer crave understanding, no longer expect history to change its view, and no longer hope that one day his story will be told more gently. McLain is not pessimistic, but coldly realistic. He knows the time ahead is not long enough to fix anything, only long enough to finish living. In that present, quiet is not a reward, but the natural consequence of having endured too much noise. McLain lives days without needing climaxes, without needing highlights, and without needing an audience. He accepts a rhythm of life, where existence is no longer measured by impact on others, but by the ability to be with himself without panic. Quiet after a broken life does not bring a sense of victory, but it brings a fragile balance, where he no longer has to defend against the world or against his own memory. McLain does not try to redefine the life that has passed, because he understands that any definition now would only add an unnecessary layer of interpretation. He lets his story exist as it is, rough, uncomfortable, and incomplete. In that quiet, there is a kind of unromantic calm, where he no longer fears being mentioned, nor hurts when forgotten. He simply wants to be at peace, not as a celebrated legend, but as a human being who has finally allowed himself to stop resisting, stop explaining, and stop demanding that life deliver an easier ending than the one it chose. The circle closes exactly where it began, with a man who no longer runs from death, nor demands that life treat him more gently. Denny McLain once stood at the peak of American baseball history, then fell in a way no one could stop, and now he stands in the present, not waiting for a miracle, but facing the final truth of himself. There is no public apology spoken, because McLain understands that apologizing cannot make the past disappear, nor can it return what was taken away. He does not stand before cameras to beg for sympathy, does not retell the story in hopes of earning a softer judgment. His silence is not avoidance, it is the acknowledgement that some things once done cannot be washed away by words. There is also no self-defense. McLain does not claim to be a victim of the system, does not blame the era, the media, or the people who left him when the lights went out. He knows that any attempt at justification now would only prolong the inner war he has decided to end. Instead, he lets the truth exist in its most naked state. He was talented, he won, he erred, and he paid the price. No part of that chain is denied, and no part is softened. McLain accepts that his life cannot be told as a tidy story with a comfortable lesson, and that very acceptance creates the final stopping point of the journey. For American audiences, McLain's story is not told to evoke pity, but to remind us of a truth rarely spoken plainly. Not everyone gets healed. Not every wound has a gentle resolution, and not every mistake is forgiven by history. A culture that glorifies victory often forgets the people who fall after the peak, and sometimes it demands happy endings even when reality does not allow them. McLain exists as a counterpoint to that need. He is proof that some lives are not allowed to be revised, renewed, or packaged into an inspiring story in the familiar way. But precisely in the absence of that miracle, another form of victory quietly emerges. Facing it is also a form of victory. Facing what one has done, lost, and destroyed, without trying to hide or redirect, requires a different kind of courage than the courage on the field. McLain does not win through titles, nor through public forgiveness. He wins by staying with the truth when every incentive to leave exists. He does not disappear, does not reinvent his image, does not construct a more palatable version of himself to be accepted. In a society that often encourages people to refresh their personal story to keep moving forward, McLain chooses to stop and acknowledge that his story has reached its limit. Closing this journey does not bring relief. The lingering resonance is heavy, quiet, and demands respect. Respect not because McLain is perfect, but because he does not pretend to be perfect. Respect because he does not turn the remaining years into a campaign to be loved, but into an honest existence with what cannot be changed. That truth may be hard to hear, hard to accept, but it reflects a very real aspect of American life. Early talent does not equate to endurance, and success does not guarantee a protected life. When the story closes, McLain does not stand in the center of light, nor vanish completely into darkness. He is somewhere else, where questions no longer need answers, and where continuing to live no longer means proving anything. No miracle appears to fix the past, but the truth is preserved, undistorted, unescaped, and perhaps allowing the truth to exist without needing redemption is the most honest ending for a life once stretched between glory and collapse. Denny McLain's story does not demand that the audience forgive, nor force anyone to admire. It only asks for one simple but difficult thing: to look straight. To look straight at the price of the peak, at people who were not protected in time, and at the reality that not every journey ends in light. When the screen goes dark and silence returns, what remains is not a neat lesson, but a heavy yet necessary feeling that sometimes honesty, however painful, is still the closest thing a person can call fair. The story of Denny McLain leaves behind a heavy and deep sadness, not because he was once great, but because the price he paid for that greatness far exceeded what a young person could bear. From the 1968 season with 31 wins, the moment that lifted him to the peak of history, to the unchecked fall that followed, we see clearly a systemic tragedy, a talent celebrated too early, but not protected, not prepared for failure, for injury, for life after the lights. When the arm collapsed before the mind could comprehend, McLain lost the only identity he had ever had. Family shattered because no one could endure the ego nurtured by victory. Money became a trap when he trusted the wrong people, and prison became the deepest fracture where his name was erased, leaving only a number. After release, society did not wait for him to return. The media remembered only 31 wins without asking the price paid, pushing him into the pain of being remembered wrong and incompletely. The most poignant thing is that McLain did not try to justify or beg for forgiveness. He chose to live in silence, taking full responsibility, letting the self-reproach stretch across decades until he only wished for it to end. Not death, but the endless inner war. For the American people, the lesson from this story is very clear and very real. Talent cannot replace maturity, success cannot compensate for the lack of systems to protect people, and society should not only glorify the peak and then turn its back when someone falls. More importantly, McLain's story reminds us that facing the truth, taking responsibility to the end, even without healing or forgiveness, is still a form of courage worthy of respect in a culture that often only celebrates winners. If the story of Denny McLain makes you reflect on the true price of glory and the courage to face the truth, subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in the next authentic stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video where we continue to look straight at lives that are not healed but still deserve respect.